This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Daniel O'Brien, K-State grain economist, kicks off the show as he talks about movement in futures and cash, more data from the WASDE report, and the U.S. and China trade deal. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond continues the show as he discusses the large differences in the weather for the past week and what we can be expecting for the unofficial start of summer. Wrapping up the show is K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner as he reviews the focus on feedlot data and what it shows for the cattle industry. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with the grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, these past few weeks, you've been describing the grain market as volatile, and is that something we continue to see?
Yes, especially with the U.S.-China trade discussions that occurred. We've had a strong up day. I believe it was on earlier this week. I believe it was on Tuesday. Almost limit, if not limit, almost limit highs coming out of some optimistic reports that came out of that set of trade negotiations. Then the markets came back down, and it's not that they distrust that the positive news out of that market with regard to ag trade will come about, but it seems to be more of a wait and see attitude. So positive to look at. So where we ended up yesterday on Thursday, the 21st of May, was that we had July corn lead contract at 462 3/4, D's corn 485 3/4. We were flirting with above $5 for D's corn earlier this week. So again, up and down sentiments with regard to market prospects. For soybeans, again, we had a 40-cent up day earlier this week on that. We've receded some since that time. July CME soybean futures closed yesterday, Thursday the 21st, at 11.93.5. November 11.86.5. That's down below $12. We had seen some movements to the strong high side that were higher than that, but we receded now. And again, we've got pretty good planting conditions. We'll talk about weather here in just a minute, weather prospects for the U.S. crops. And then for Kansas City wheat also had some positive moments in the last week, 1 or 2 weeks. Have seen July closed yesterday at 686 3/4, and then D's 26 at $7.12 3/4. So without question, stronger prices now than we've seen in the past. Some real unanswered questions with regard to the international side. I should add in also on cash prices, as the futures had declined some this week in the last several days. Cash price, of course, followed suit with generally consistent, not lots of change in basis, although in some of the areas, especially for say soybeans in areas that we might be looking for export prospects, we did see some basis variation, at least that I could follow. So corn prices still above $4 at all locations. Strongest cash corn price actually it was $4.52 in the Pittsburgh area, southeast Kansas, $4.32 Garden City, $4.33 Topeka. So interesting to see how that's all playing out. That'd be for the spot price. For new crop bids, still $4.75 Garden City, $4.65 Pittsburgh. This would be for harvest delivery, and then range from $4.20 to $4.47 thereabouts elsewhere. So interesting moves. Cash prices for sorghum, upfront bids over $4 in Hutchinson and Topeka area, $3.70, $3.88, $3.42 in other parts of the state. Strongest in that both the export-oriented locations in the state that we follow. New crop bids, $4.25 bid out in northwest Kansas, and $4, $4.05, et cetera, in the Salina, Hutchinson, Topeka area. So interesting to watch all that. Garden City, $3.95 new crop bid. For soybeans, strongest bids on the cash side, actually $11.64 in Topeka, $11.30 Salina, $11.44 Pittsburgh, and out to the west, really more like 10 1074, 1079, something like that. Wheat bids, of course, wheat harvest is not that far away. We just had the Kansas Wheat Tour. That information came out, generally confirmed for the most part the USDA's projection of 37 bushels per acre for the state, although the tour came in and at about 38, 39 bushels. And so we'll see. We've got wet, cool weather. We'll see how the crop finishes out. Strongest cash bids, though, are around $6.67 in the Salina Hutchinson area, $6.57 in Topeka, lesser elsewhere. New crop bids, and again, a lot of uncertainty. There's always a question whether do you take a bid at this time or not, with the riskiness of weather and whatever else can come in. But the strongest new crop bid actually is in Hutchinson, that we saw on Thursday at $6.86, $6.74, Topeka, $6.67, Salina, and lesser thereabouts from there. So just interesting to watch.
And as we are looking at this market, last week we got a WASDE report, and any additional thoughts you have around that as it's now kind of really gotten to the market?
Yeah, the market's turned its attention more to U.S.-China trade results that came out earlier this week. But there's some things we didn't get to talk about last week that are pretty important. That the projected ending stocks for wheat, world wheat, world corn, world soybeans, all came in below, and in some cases, pretty sharply below pre-report expectations. And for wheat, we actually came in even below the bottom end of the trade expectations. So again, by the time we were looking at other geopolitical issues, trade negotiations, we didn't pay that much attention to the world aspects of those reports. But here it is. We're projecting tighter ending stocks for all these major crops than we had been expecting. You do hear on the fringe people wringing their hands like any good economist would do about risks to the world situation in terms of food supplies, et cetera. If we start to see a downward trend in even further in world stocks for these major grains. So surely something to watch. A lot of that right now will have to do both with U.S. crops, of course, this summer, but also what's happening in South America. If it's okay, I'd like to shift gears over to to where we stand with regard to the China U.S. information that came out. Generally, that information, as it was announced, was responded to very, very positively in the grain futures markets. Again, strong days for soybeans especially, but pretty good days for wheat, for corn. And after that first day, then we tended to go sideways to lower from there. It's not that people don't think that the promise of China coming into the market buying 25 million metric tons more of soybeans in the next several years isn't necessarily a good promise, and also the promise to purchase about $17 billion plus of other ag products, that including again corn, sorghum, wheat, that those aren't good. But I think we've taken more of a wait and see approach. If we were borrowing from popular culture, we'd say, show me the money. I think they'll want to see actual purchases on the books, actual shipments before they count a lot on that. And it's really I guess I call it a contingent or a dependent based set of forecasts. It's really dependent upon the U.S. and China still being in good graces with one another on these major geopolitical issues. Taiwan being one of them, China's involvement in Middle Eastern geopolitics on the other, all in play. In fact, if anything, we've heard more concern of late, really, about the future of energy markets, what with just the conflict at the Straits of Hormuz overseas, what that could do to oil, how that thing comes in and impacts U.S. ethanol production, i.e. corn usage, biodiesel production, i.e. soybean oil usage. So these are all in play. Been a fair question asked. So is this really a consequential agreement or not? We do hear news from countries like Brazil that in their thinking, if China does come through and buys this much grain and oil seeds from the United States, then they would be looking towards rerouting some of their grain export flows. So it's that big of a deal that if China really followed through on these purchases for soybeans and other crops, and also beef exports also out of the U.S., that's also at play. If China really followed through and bought that, then then other countries that have been involved in exports to China are probably going to have less purchases and have to reroute their trade. So it's an important issue. I would say I saw one quote from an overseas analyst. I'll just quote: the 17 billion in U.S. ag products can at most be understood as an intention to purchase. It's not impossible that it will be carried out later, but the level of certainty is relatively low. So that to me explains that the initial strong response in the grain markets, and then in the days afterwards being a little more cautious, just realizing that the geopolitical disagreements amongst these two major countries can certainly have an impact on how those U.S. ag and China ag trade flows actually occur.
Daniel, as we've been talking about all this, what does it mean for our farmer?
Well, I think that if we actually sell that many soybeans to China, that's a strong positive for the soybean market and China's involvement with the U.S. If they're positive towards buying soybeans, they're probably positive towards buying grain sorghum. So that also is a strong positive, especially for us in Kansas and on down into Texas. So a lot riding on this for both those markets, and really for in our locale, especially for the sorghum industry, that pretty important that we have that differentiated flow of grain sorghum to China to uphold the demand side for U.S. grain sorghum, and with that you see prices. So it has a lot of impact on prices. And last thing I'd say, if we actually have that strong a soybean market, then you have more acreage competition in the U.S. in the next several years between soybeans and corn and other crops. So it affects them both, either directly or indirectly. So we shall see.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Chip, last week you mentioned expecting to see flooding and fire in Kansas, and is that what we saw this last week?
That is what we saw, and we get in Kansas, we get both extremes, and sometimes at the same time, and that's what occurred. It was a very interesting weekend into early part of this week with active weather pattern. Really, when we think about a classic May weather in Kansas, where eastern part of the state seeing tornadoes and flooding and severe weather, and the western part of the state is on the dry side, typically split up by a dry line in the middle somewhere, and we have really hot, dry, windy conditions in the western part. So as we had a storm system that was very slow to move, we had multiple rounds of thunderstorms that developed each afternoon on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And Monday, obviously, capping it off with the most widespread and extreme conditions. We had a tornado outbreak was expected. I know the Storm Prediction Center expected long-track violent tornadoes, potentially with a moderate risk out. Thankfully, that didn't quite come to fruition. We look at the low levels of the atmosphere, and just a little too stable, a little too much cool air at the surface. And that resulted in not being able to get that upward lift that we needed for those. And we're really, really grateful for that. We still ended up with multiple tornadoes. I know the National Weather Service in Topeka confirmed at least 7 tornadoes, the longest being about 12 miles long in Marshall County there north of Blue Rapids. Thankfully, it didn't do a whole lot of damage, just some trees. It was mainly a rural area. So we're very, very lucky that happened. Additionally, we had lots of wind. More wind than was expected. Once those storms, those individual storms that had some tornado potential, especially on Monday, kind of converged into a line of storms as a much stronger cold front pushed through the area. That resulted in some pretty strong winds. We had wind gusts measured up to 60, 65 miles an hour, and a fair amount of tree damage, especially in the Manhattan area, right down 24 into Wamego. And then again in the Kansas City area, where lots of trees down, trees that leafed out here over the last several weeks. And so it adds stress, just more weight to some of these trees. And then we've had some drought stress and some moisture stress on them. And that tends to lead to trees getting uprooted a little bit easier, or any trees that have any rotten portions or portions that need pruned off. that naturally get pruned by these strong winds. And I know just in my neighborhood, about 4 trees on different houses. So that's obviously not very fun, and so widespread damage to that sense. And then lastly, we did have some hail. We had some wording expected from the Storm Prediction Center saying 4 to 5 inch hail possible. Thankfully, that also didn't really happen thanks to the stable lower levels, but we still had many episodes of 1 to 2 inch hail reports across central and eastern Kansas. And then we got moisture. We really, really needed rainfall for some parts of the state, really the entire state. And biggest rainfall totals I saw were in that 4 to 5 inch range. Isolated areas in central and eastern Kansas received that much. Some got it very quickly. That resulted in some flash flooding. And we had quite a bit of runoff, especially due to those drier soils. A lot of those places had gone 15 to nearly 20 days without wetting rainfall. And what that does is it lets the soils dry out. And when they get that dry that quickly, they become hydrophobic. Basically, the water won't go into the ground easily. It needs a long-term period to soak that in and be able to let that moisture penetrate it. And when we get heavy rain for 2 hours, and that's the magnitude of the event, and it's done after that, it doesn't give that moisture enough time to soak into the ground. So very active severe weather. And we also saw some very light precipitation in the western part of the state here on Thursday and again on Friday, where we finally saw light rain showers bringing some moisture, higher humidity, especially to areas that didn't receive some of that heavier rainfall earlier in the week.
And on the topic of fire and flooding, you were recently at a few fires serving as a meteorologist and a firefighter. And what were you seeing?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we had a round of thunderstorms that moved through southwest Kansas last Thursday, and we were expecting it. And unfortunately, the air was just so dry at the low levels, and this area is all in extreme drought. And so the ground is extremely dry as well. And once we got those thunderstorms, the rain was not able to reach the ground. And with that, with lightning, we saw basically every lightning flash that occurred cloud to ground in southwest Kansas started a wildfire. And we had tens of wildfires between basically Morton County eastward all the way to Comanche County along the Oklahoma border. These fires then got pushed around by strong winds from these thunderstorms, and so they were very erratic and the fire moved in different directions. And that's also an area where we have a lot of grasslands and a lot of steep, rugged terrain. I know it's Kansas. People don't think of Kansas as steep, rugged terrain, but a lot of those are big canyons down there that have very few roads and are really rough and hard to access. So once fire gets established down in those canyons, it's hard to stop them. And what happened was that you were getting these wind shifts and fire was moving rapidly across the landscape through some of that rougher terrain. And then unfortunately coming out of that rougher terrain and making runs through even things like wheat fields that still weren't completely cured out. They still had green in them, but it's been so dry that even the wheat was carrying fire despite it not being 100% cured. So when we had that, it just allowed those fires to rapidly grow and expand way beyond local control. They brought in outside resources from out of state to come in and help kind of corral those fires. And while we were getting severe weather in eastern Kansas, they had temperatures exceeding 100 degrees with low single digit humidities and wind gusts 30 to 40 miles an hour every day and seemingly a different direction every day. And that just allowed for fire to just kind of rekindle. And we had so much fire in the landscape that would just stand up and burn in another direction towards communities, unfortunately. And so thankfully, we kept them out of most of the communities and were able to corral them and put them out over time. But it was a multi-day battle in southwest Kansas that went on for about 4 days, 5 days, that involved hundreds of people and took a monumental effort from the state, local, and even some federal resources to help kind of bring those down to a conclusion and put those out completely. And now, thankfully, the humidity's definitely come up statewide with this change in the weather pattern, and we're definitely seeing much reduced fire weather concerns, and the fields are finally starting to green up out there with a little bit of moisture, and definitely a much needed end to fire season, I think, is occurring across the state. Now, that's not to say we can't have more fires moving forward. We still have extreme drought. It's going to take almost months of moisture and cooler weather to help offset the extreme drought that's developed over the past few weeks to months in that region.
What outlook are you seeing for the weather?
Yeah, so we look at the weather as a whole, the patterns definitely change. Instead of big, powerful storm systems like we saw earlier this week, now the jet stream split into a northern and a southern jet stream, what they call the Arctic jet stream or polar jet stream in the north, and the subtropical jet stream to the south. El Nino is starting to really enhance that southern subtropical jet stream to our south. And so that's allowing some moisture to push northward into our region, and just enough to make things more humid. But then we don't get the big storm systems since the jet streams are not phased together. And we get these subtle waves that allow for rounds of showers and some isolated thunderstorms, thankfully sub-severe. And that's hit and miss, kind of frustrating, especially as you go into Memorial Day weekend with predictability being extremely low on these. But what it means is we have definitely transitioned into a slightly cooler, wetter, more moist pattern that it brings some needed precipitation for vegetation across state in that longer duration period. And then also kind of keeps those temperatures in check. We were really getting warm, and with the cloud cover and precipitation, it definitely helps offset those warmer than normal temperatures. Now, as we move later into Memorial Day weekend, we do see a little bit more prominent high pressure that tries to build in. There's still pretty high moisture content, so I still can't rule out every day, both on Sunday and Monday, of a stray shower or storm. But predictability is obviously low, and I don't expect widespread wetting precipitation, so less than a quarter inch for the most part for the entire state. But then as we move into next week, we start to eyeball at least warmer temperatures as a whole, slightly above average with highs in the low 80s. Kind of welcome warmth, I suppose, since it is going to be the unofficial start to summer here with Memorial Day. And then quiet weather-wise, we just don't really see any potent severe weather concerns because of that split jet stream until maybe the beginning part of June, when we might start getting those jet streams start to phase a little bit better. And that could bring another round of severe weather and maybe some more widespread rainfall that's of the heavier variety.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. One way you can keep up to date with weather in Kansas is by checking out K-State's Mesonet website. That web address is Mesonet.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing the Focus on Feedlots report with K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, as we do talk about this Focus on Feedlots, what month time span are we looking at?
Yeah, so one of the things that it's always important to orient the listeners to, I think, with the Focus on Feedlot segment here is that we're always a bit behind. So as we think about current month of, we're certainly in May. I'm collecting April data for the Focus on Feedlots. So here today, we're going to be talking about March 2026 closeouts here today.
And when we're looking at this data, what are we seeing for steers and heifers?
What we've seen here in our data set within the Focus on Feedlots during the spring here is we've actually seen very strong feedlot marketings for heifers. And so that trend once again continues with 26,371 head of heifers being marketed through the feedlots relative to about 17,000 head of steers. So, typically, historically in the Focus on Feedlots, we have marketed more steers than heifers. So those numbers have flipped a bit. I think that's certainly an indication that we are sending a good number of those females through the feed yard system, through the feedlot, and not necessarily retaining them there on the ranch. I think the other important thing to point out here, just kind of big picture items. Once again, we've had a lot of conversations about exit weights and days on feed. For most of the spring, the numbers that we're going to talk about here today, right on trend, in excess of 1,500 pound exit weights on the steers, really bumping close to 200 days on feed, 1395 on the heifers once again, so right next to 1,400 pound heifers and 182 days on feed. So we're certainly seeing some cattle as we extend days on feed and continue to push those exit weights closer to 1,400 pounds on the heifers and in excess of 1,500 pounds on the average for the steer calves.
As we go more into the summer months, does that average daily gain decrease as we get hotter?
So certainly weather can have an impact on cattle performance in terms of really where we see the biggest impacts, I'm going to say, of weather, both hot and cold stress, is really going to be in terms of feed conversion. It's a little more inconsistent in terms of the response in terms of average daily gain, but more consistently we'll see some impacts there in feed conversion. Typically the summer months, I don't know that I see as much of a performance decline there in the summer. It's more pronounced in the long-term data set, especially when we get into the winter months and we've got extremely cold, long winters with, maybe an exceptional amount of snowfall. Those are really when we see those numbers start to shift a little bit. But there are certainly a lot of seasonal impacts when you look at our data set from a historical standpoint.
What other information is included with this summary?
Yeah, so the focus on feedlots, just to kind of review, is essentially a feedlot closeout and cattle performance and commodity survey that we do of 5 feed yards, mostly within the western half of the state. So the steers, we marketed 17,660 head of steers. Average in weight this month was 815 pounds on the steers, 783 on the heifers. As I mentioned earlier, just a touch over 26,000 head of heifers were marketed. So certainly seeing those strong heifer marketing through the feed yard. Final weight 1525 on the steers, 1395 on the heifers. Average days on feed, we were at 196 on the steers and 182 on the heifers. Average daily gain 355 and 3.3 on the heifers. In terms of feed to gain, we were at 654 so to 685 on the heifers. Death loss 1.59% on the steers, 1.43% on the heifers. In terms of our cost to gain, in terms of the cattle that were marketed in the March 2026 closeout, we were 103.85 on the steers and 109.53 on the heifers. Now, as we get into the projected cost to gain, so these would be cattle that would be coming into the feedlot, and we're actually projecting what their cost of gain will be moving forward. So this would be projected cost of gain for cattle coming on feed in the month of April of 2026. We were at 104.67 on the steers and 111.33 on the heifers. Corn, really steady this month. We've been around that 450 range here through most of the spring. So we're at 453 with a range of 419 to 471 a bushel. In terms of alfalfa, really unchanged there. We're at 143.40 with a range of 127.60 to 155.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Tuesday, as we will not have a show on Monday for Memorial Day.